On a winter morning, my son smiled. Call it rent. I didn't cry. I turned on the voice recorder, filed the papers into the binder, replaced the porch light bulb, and poured more coffee. On the night of confrontation, I let the evidence speak. If it were you, would you choose anger or let the truth open the door on its own? Morning was slow, like an old man rising from a chair. The kitchen was half dark, only a thin yellow light over the sink casting itself onto the dried water streaks from the night before. The kettle breathed out a thin ribbon of steam, then clicked. The indicator light went off right on time. He lifted the kettle off its base, tilted his hand slowly. The boiling water fell with a small purring sound, hitting the belly of the ceramic cup that had held its warmth. He capped the cup with the ceramic lid to keep in the heat. The sound of glaze fitting snug against the rim was as soft as a resolve that didn't need to be spoken. On the wooden table, the expense ledger lay open to yesterday's page. The paper was rough, the edges slightly curled from damp, a few pencil strokes blurred into gray shadows. He sat down, drew the book closer, rolled the short pencil once around in his hand to take the chill off. The pencil tip touched paper, leaving a thin stroke, forthright and not pleading. From now on, no more adding the word save. He looked at the words as if peering at his face in a fogged mirror, not pretty but true. His calloused hand held the edge of the page, his palm still carrying the drywood smell of the tabletop. He laid the pencil level with the ruled line, as if hammering in a small nail to keep this intention from drifting. Outside there was still the susurrus of a cold deep, but in the kitchen everything stopped exactly where it needed to. The stainless ladle lay still on the dish towel, the towel's edge folded square. At the corner of the table, a faint circle of old coffee had dried. He touched it with his fingertip, didn't rub it away. He simply set the new cups down on that exact ring, as if returning a habit to where it used to belong. Warm coffee scent rose through the slit of the ceramic lid, touched the bridge of his nose, and eased his chest by a notch. He pulled the chair in, his back straighter than usual. His breathing slowed, found a cadence, like the clock in the living room ticking steadily through the wall. He did not think about the hurried times he pulled out his wallet, did not think of the voice that once tightened and made his chest shrink. He left all of that outside the kitchen, beyond the riverbank, beyond some coming day. Here there was only paper and graphite. He repeated to himself, without forming words, he would speak by paper, not by tears. He turned the book, flipped back a few old pages, the numbers repeating like the steps of someone familiar with a steep road. Electricity bill, gas, cough syrup, fixing the porch roof in the last rainy season. On each page there was a mute streak, places where he added no further notes, knowing that saying more would change nothing. He tapped the pencil tip against the paper's edge, returned to today's page. The blank space holding the sentence he had just written looked like a backyard cleared of weeds. It invited no one, but was ready for a different path. The kettle's sound cooled, the metal body stopped vibrating. He lifted the ceramic lid, and the full-bodied coffee fragrance poured out. He blew very softly, not because it was hot, but as a ritual to force himself to slow down once more. The first sip went down his throat, leaving a warm trail. In his chest, the vague anger remained, a bitterness from many sleepless nights, but it stayed at the bottom, did not bubble up. On the surface, there was only a still lake. He set the cup down, adjusted its position to please the eye. His thumb tapped a very light beat on the handle, as if signaling to himself. On the counter, the window pane was still fogged, the first light of day not yet spilled in. He didn't draw the curtain. He wanted the kitchen to hold on to this half-dark a little longer, to give the thought he had just written time to cling to the wood, the paper, the steaming ceramic cup. Everything stood still where it was set, needing no witness. For a moment his wrist tightened, the memory of times he was pushed into explaining, questions like barbed hooks. He inhaled deeply, laid his fingers flat on the wooden tabletop. The wood grain curved like little rivers running beneath the skin. He counted from 1 to 10, as simply as he had counted the planks that needed replacing on the porch in the rainy season. When he finished, his palm was still there, flat, not trembling, The helplessness that had once made him bow his head had become an object he could set down as he set down a pencil, a ledger, a cup. Set it down and watch it lie still. He took up the pencil again, added a line for the date and a blank box after the word notes. That blank was for tomorrow or for some quiet witness later on. But for now, it was a space to breathe. At the page's edge, he drew a thin line dividing the need section and the want section. Under need, he wrote no one's name. Under want, neither. Titles no longer mattered now. There remained only the things that had to be done to keep things straight. Record, file, reconcile, keep. He stood, carried the cup past the counter, set it on the saucer whose glaze was chipped at one corner. He turned the gas down so the blue flame was just a thin line keeping the room warm. The vent pipe overhead quivered, like a taut rope strung across the riverbank in front of the factory. It must be tight, but not screech. He smoothed the dish towel spread on the table, aligning its edge with the wooden edge. One small task, then another small tasks that helped him keep his balance. When the cup was half empty, his eyes were less filmed with mist. He closed the ledger, not tucking the pencil inside, but laying it parallel to the spine, the point facing to the right, the direction he would head. From here, he knew he would need the patience of paperwork, the stamina of figures, and the quiet of morning routines. No specific plan had yet been named, but a decision had stood upright in this kitchen between the heat-keeping ceramic lid and a thin pencil line. From now on, every voice would go through paper. Tears, if there were any, would be left behind before he stepped through the door. He pressed his palm to the wooden table once more, held it there for exactly 3 breaths. Then he drew his hand back and cradled the cup for warmth. No need to think any further. This morning, that was enough. Keep a cup of coffee warm, keep one sentence intact, and keep his back straight when sitting in the familiar chair. The rest, like the light that would come when he drew the curtain, would arrive in its own time. He pulled the manila ring binder from the wooden drawer, its pale yellow surface polished smooth along the edges. The metal hinge made a small sound as it opened, crisp and precise. On the tabletop, he spread the papers into low stacks, pension statements printed in slightly faded black ink. SSA appointment slips with date stamps, the upper right corners still scored by a staple. 2 photos of the house before the title transfer, the porch roof not yet replaced and still sagging at one corner, the receipt for repairing the porch roof that rainy season, the thermal paper already yellowed. He wasn't in a hurry. Each sheet was smoothed with the back of his hand and nudged to align its edges like straightening an old road. He sorted them by time, the old underneath, the new on top, so that flipping through would follow a single line of breath. At key spots, he folded one corner lightly, just enough for a finger to find later without tearing the paper. In the middle of the binder, the 2 silver rings opened. He fed the first stack through and heard a soft click as they closed. That click repeated a few times, evenly, giving the kitchen a second rhythm beyond the wall clock. On the binder's spine, he stuck a strip of brown paper tape and wrote 4 small words in pencil. File, by year. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right, unadorned but clean. Inside, he placed an empty white envelope in the first pocket and labeled it New Receipts. The envelope lay flat, its flap unsealed, like a calm interval of waiting. On the first page, he slipped in a ruled sheet and wrote a few tidy lines. Date, place, content. No complaint, just categories sufficient for use. He lifted the 2 photos of the house closer to the kitchen light. One shot from the riverbank looking in. The front porch sagged. The yellow bulb swayed in the wind. The other shot from the porch looking out. The wooden handrail his hand touched every day, the surface worn bright where his wrist tended to rest. Along the photo's margin, an old fingerprint had faded. He wiped that mark with the corner of his shirt, not to make the photo prettier, but so the gaze, when he set it down in the binder, would not stumble. Under porch roof repair receipts, he checked the amount, the dates, the name of the handyman. One receipt had an old coffee stain, a pale brown ring like a halo around the moon. He touched it lightly with his fingertip, then let go. What had passed still left a mark, but a mark doesn't speak on its own. One must point to it with a patient order. He drew his chair back and looked at the binder filling up. Nothing was loud, but everything stood in its proper line, like bricks supporting a new step. He left the table and went to the fridge. A bus schedule was held by a fish-shaped magnet, rows of departures and arrivals running dense. In the margin, a few days had been slashed in red with a felt tip, early time slots repeating each week. He circled the route to the SSA office, drew a thin line to the return time in case he had to wait long. Beside the schedule, a felt tip was clipped beneath a small magnet. He tested the ink on the edge of the schedule, a thin, even red stroke. He put the pen back exactly where it belonged, tipped down so the ink wouldn't dry out. A small habit, keeping big things from being broken by a stray detail. The fridge door settled shut, the rubber gasket pressing to the edge, snug and tight. He stood a few more seconds, rereading the red marks he himself had placed. Under the kitchen light, the circles looked like life buoys drifting evenly across the white paper. Not for him to jump into, but to remind him there is always a punctual beat to hold on to. He returned to the chair, opened the drawer, and took out the work shirt cured with the smell of wood. The weave was thick, the cuffs worn where they had rubbed against a tape measure for years. He shook it gently, dry wood and weak sunlight lifted up. He folded it in half, then in thirds, smoothed the crease, and set it beside the gray backpack gone pale. The backpack's zipper running along its length gave a small rasp as he pulled it to check, then closed it. In the front pocket, he checked again the pencil, the small notebook, and an empty envelope. Everything was ready not for going far, but so that, if needed, he wouldn't have to rummage. The old wallet lay at the edge of the table, the brown leather softened like cloth. He opened it and lifted the cloudy plastic that held 3 old photos of his wife. The first, she sat on the porch step, hair pinned high, smiling without showing teeth, her hand resting on a pot of geraniums. The second, the two of them stood side by side in the old kitchen, steam rising to blur half the frame. The third, the smallest, a studio photo with a chipped corner. She tilted her head, her eyes looking off the lens, as if listening to a kettle boiling somewhere. With his little finger, he smoothed the photo edges so they lay flat in the wallet, not curling up to catch against the plastic. The wallet closed with a soft click. He set the shirt, backpack, and wallet into a small row on the tabletop orderly, like a reminder meant only for himself. Across the kitchen, the kettle had cooled. The morning's first cup of coffee had a swallow left. He finished it and set the cup on the same faint old ring. In the moment of the kitchen's hush, he heard clearly his own breathing going slow through his chest, along the sternum, down into the belly, then back up. Preparation, so it turns out, was mainly setting small things upright. He turned the manila binder once more and pressed his hand lightly on the spine as if stamping a seal, not for luck, not for sending wishes. Simply a confirmation, with a calloused hand, that everything had been set in its frame. In the gold of early morning, before the curtains were opened, the kitchen felt like a small workshop where an old craftsman gives the joints a final check before hanging the sign repaired. He switched off the light, left the room half in shadow, and walked out back straight, his mind as trim as the binder that had just closed. The late winter wind slipped in from the river through the rows of low houses, carrying the smell of damp metal and oil smoke. The factory gate at the edge of town had just silenced its shift bell. A flock of black birds went into a tizzy along the power lines. The embankment was blotched with salt. The darkened water drifted slow, a barge pushing white pinpricks of light that broke into long streaks. On the main street, the laundromat sign flickered green and went out, and then on again. The pawn shop pulled down its heavy metal shutter, leaving a thin sliver of light. The red brick library sat quiet as a box of books asleep, the steps filmed with a fine frost, the weekend reading poster curling at the corner. Wind swept across his porch and made the telephone wire tremble. The porch bulb flickered, bright for a beat, dipped, then tried to climb back. The old 2-story house had paint bleached thin. The porch rail was polished in patches where people tended to grip as they stepped down. The doormat lay askew, speckled with a few grains of road salt. The screen door gave a tiny sound when the wind slipped through. Each time the porch light blinked, the glass pane in the main door reflected a scrap of the far-off river like a streak of graphite. On the porch wall was an old nail mark where a Christmas wreath had hung. The nylon cord was still knotted, the tip of the monofilament flicking lightly in the wind. Inside, the kitchen opened into a small dining room. The refrigerator hummed steadily. The oven held its heat, its yellow light spilling onto the faux brick-patterned vinyl floor. Dinner was laid out simply. Thick-sliced roast meat, mashed potatoes, canned green beans kept on low. In the saucepot, a stainless steel spoon was half submerged, its handle catching a bright line. On the table, a cheap small checkered cloth, porcelain plates with the glaze chipped at the rim, mismatched knives and forks, one with a wooden handle darkened by oil. The smell of dish soap mixed with the cooling meat fat in the air, with a thread of damp coat smell from jackets drying near the heater. He sat in the corner chair, his back not quite resting. His hands lay parallel to his plate, the empty coffee cup above his right hand. No one spoke. Each time someone pushed food aside, a spoon touched a plate, a thin sound like a thread drawn across the tabletop. The wall clock ticked steadily, notching the seconds. The tiny cut-off click of the refrigerator came in and slipped out like a stifled cough. In the living room corner, the TV was on mute, the images moving slow, a snowstorm in another state, a weather map in cool colors. That blue light sometimes slid across the table's edge, then was blocked by the shadow of someone getting up for water. The two children sat opposite each other, shoulders rounded over their bowls. The older boy stole a look at him over the rim of his plate, his gaze resting for a second on the old wallet set close to the man's elbow, then dropped to stir his potatoes. The younger girl twirled her fork once, making a faint scratch on the plate's glaze. She reached for the napkins and dropped one. The napkin touched the floor, spun once, its edge brushing the shadow of a foot. The daughter-in-law stood up almost without a sound, picked up the fallen napkin between two fingers, crumpled it very small, then let it fall into the trash can by the sink. The gesture was quick, clean, leaving no aftertaste. On the shelf, a glass jar of pickled cucumbers, its lid tarnished yellow, stood neatly beside the jar of wooden spoons. The kitchen light touched those surfaces and gave back a patient kind of shine. The window over the sink held condensation. Droplets ran the channels of the glass, gathered at the bottom edge and dropped onto the forgotten sponge. Outside, the porch light flickered again. Light slipped through the thin curtain into short stripes across the tabletop, blinking like the beat of an eye. His son sat at the head of the table, the laptop opened slightly askew. The screen cast blue and white spreadsheet cells across his face. His finger moved the mouse, paused on a cell, then dragged down a few rows. The screen light fell along his cheekbones, highlighting a morning shave that wasn't quite clean. Each time he tapped a key, the keyboard made a steady click, merging with the spoon-on-plate sounds into a shared rhythm. Next to the laptop was a stack of unopened envelopes, piled in reverse. The edge of the top one was slightly bent, as if it had just slipped out of a thick coat pocket. By the wall, a workman's coat hung on a hook near the back door. On the floor, a pair of rubber boots stood inverted to dry. The entryway floor held faded white salt prints, wiped over but still streaked. Draped over a chairback was a gray wool scarf, a few stitches unraveled. When the window trembled in the wind, the yarn trembled too, brushing the chairback, making a rustle hardly loud enough to count as a sound. There was a silence longer than the gap between two spoon taps. In that silence, he lifted his glass of water and took a small sip. As he set it down, he tried not to touch the electric bill that had slid under the plate's edge. The daughter-in-law watched his hand for half a second, then turned away and opened the oven to check the heat. The door breathed a wash of hot air up into her face. The glass fogged and then cleared quickly. She slid the tray, adjusted the remaining roast, pushed it in, closed it, every movement short and neat. A truck went by on the road, the side of it shuddering. The porch light caught, came bright, then blinked again. The leafless tree in the front yard swept a shadow across the wall, a streak like a pencil line. An old wedding photo hanging near the china cabinet sat a bit off. The hanger wire rubbed the wall and left a fresh white mark. No one straightened it. Everything was left as is a little. To say the thing no one said. As the food dwindled, bowls and plates stacked up, the edge of the table showed clearly the scratches of time. The son folded the laptop halfway shut, leaving a corner open as if saving a place. His back leaned slightly forward. Spreadsheet light still leaked into the corner of his eye. The daughter-in-law changed out plates, gathered the breadcrumbs into her palm, then swept them into the trash. The two children held their glasses of milk, their lips leaving white rings on the rims. The older licked the milk trace at his mouth, looked out the window for a moment, then lowered his gaze again. In that moment, he leaned back a little more, but did not quite let go. The wind on the porch had lost some bite. The river sounded farther away. Only the clock went on ticking off the minutes. The porch bulb flickered again, like a person standing at the door, hesitating whether to knock. The house breathed in its own way, quietly, on time, without complaint. So did the town. The boilers would kick on again the next morning. The bus would pull into the stop according to the red circles on the schedule. The river would keep carrying the smell of iron and old water. And in this small dark kitchen, the simple dinner came to its close by way of small soft contacts, glances dropping to bowls, and a porch light that had not yet decided where to settle. The scrape of a chair left a thin streak of sound across the tile floor, like a blade gliding over glaze and going dead at the table's edge. That thin streak didn't break off entirely. It still hung in the air, stagged on the window curtain cord, and trembling slightly each time the wind rushed onto the porch. He set the knife down. The tip didn't touch the cutting board, but stopped a thread's width short, like stopping a sentence just before it becomes words. The napkin in his hand he folded square, edge meeting edge, and laid it neatly to the right of the plate. His thumb ran once along the crease to straighten it. On the table, breadcrumbs were sparsely scattered, the kitchen light catching on them as tiny points of brightness. No one looked at anyone else for more than 3 seconds. Every glance that crossed the tabletop was like a leaf drifting past an ankle touching, then slipping to the bottom. The daughter-in-law stood to pour more water, the rim of the glass touching the spout with a dry ting. She tilted the pitcher to change the light's angle, making a faint glint of glass grain run across her hand. When she sat, she pulled the chair halfway, paused, adjusted it, then let her body touch the chair back. His son closed the laptop a little. The screen still threw blue onto his cheekbones, the bands of spreadsheet cells reflecting as little squares that hopped lightly with the roll of the mouse. The two children hunched their shoulders, spoons tapping the plate rims in a steady but careful beat, as if afraid of spilling the sound. On the wall, the clock ticked steadily, so steadily that if it stopped suddenly, the whole house would likely startle. Each tick was like a finger tapping the cardstock of a bill envelope. Electricity, water, gas, internet. The second hand crossed the 12, masking an old scratch on the glass, and then moving on. Below the clock, a double outlet held a white plug only halfway in. The cord ran along the baseboard and looped through a coil of black tape. The tape's edge had peeled back, one side frayed like a stray gray hair. He lifted his water glass and saw a milky whirl shimmering at the bottom. His wrist turned by old habit, the motion slow, as if testing whether any inner rattle remained. There was none. Only the heater's steady breathing in the living room corner, and the coat hanging on the hook tapping lightly against the wall when the wind hissed through the seam of the back door. Outside, the porch light flickered bright for a longer beat, then weak, then flaring back like someone remembering something to do but briefly forgetting. The piece of meat on his plate cooled, the fat setting into a rich rim at the edge. He used the back of his fork to push it aside, leaving a thin, oily sheen on the white glaze. As he raised the fork, he paused halfway, as if catching a thin scent. The smell of a work shirt drying by the heater, the smell of dry wood clinging to a cuff. He set the fork down, switched hands for the napkin, and tidied the plate's rim. Unnecessary, perhaps, but it calmed him. His son's phone lit for a beat, went dark, then lit again. He didn't pick it up. That light threw a sliver of scrolling text across the table, breaking into unreadable shapes before it vanished. The daughter-in-law cocked her ear toward some sound in the kettle, but it was only heat contracting one small thunk. She put the sauce bottle back, turned the label to face straight. A bit of oil clung to her fingertip, which she wiped onto the backside of the tablecloth. Exactly one dot. The wind slipped through the double panes. A faint hiss where the rubber gasket was cracked and made the decorative candle in the corner quiver once, though it wasn't lit. His eyes followed that tremor, then came back to the small frame before him. Plate, napkin, knife and fork, water glass. This order was a gentle thing, like the ruled lines in a school notebook. So long as you keep each object in its square, you'll pass through dinner without chipping anything. Another chair scraped back. The thin line of sound scored the tile again. Longer, higher, then closed. The younger girl reached out to swap the salt and pepper, touched the old wooden knob of the pepper shaker. A peppercorn fell, rolled in a circle, and stopped right at the edge of his napkin. He pinched it between thumb and forefinger, dropped it back into the shaker, and turned the cap one notch tighter. The small act warmed his fingers. On the wall, the clock nudged into a new minute. The minute hand crossed a thicker mark and gave a sound softer than usual, and yet it was the same sound, the sound of amounts due. He heard it not only with his ears. It passed through his sternum, perched for a moment at the nape, then down the middle of his shoulders. In recent evenings, that sound kept packing itself in, bit by bit, thickening the air like soup reheated too long on the stove. His son shifted his legs, a knee brushing the underside of the table, jostling the glass in the corner. The water ring around its base widened by one more ring. He inhaled, exhaled, tapped a beat on the tabletop, then stopped. The laptop opened a notch wider. The blue deepened, hiding half the yellow light on the table. That shadow stretched a little toward him, like the shadow of a number slipping off the page and touching the neatly folded napkin. A car went by on the street, bouncing through a pothole, dumping a thud like a manhole cover shifting. The porch bulb blinked twice, quickly. Inside, the daughter-in-law gathered the plates, her left hand supporting, her right hand sweeping crumbs into her palm, leaning just enough to avoid touching his elbow. She set the plates in the sink and turned the tap to a small stream. The water striking the steel made a hollow sound. She turned the heat down so the warm water wouldn't splash up onto the glass. Fresh steam thinned into air, already holding the smell of soap. He slid the water glass to the left, his index finger resting on the handle as if to keep a heavy object from slipping. If anyone looked, they might think he was about to say something, but he wasn't. He only squared the glass with the table's edge, then laid both hands on his thighs, fingertips touching to form a small tent. The overhead light traced a straight line across his finger joints, looking like a gently taut string. Dinner grew heavier, not because more dishes were added, but because the space between sounds kept thinning. The last sound of spoon against plate fell silent. The TV in the living room switched to a cough syrup commercial, the audio still muted, the woman on the screen smiling, a soundless smile, while two lines of small print ran back and forth. The wall clock pointed to a new hour. In the moment when the whole family sat and no one made any other movement, the tick sounded like a stamp pressed onto an envelope. He heard it and set his palm on his thigh, holding it there for exactly 2 breaths. Outside, the river kept to its belly, slow and heavy. The porch, with its flickering bulb, was like an eyelid trying to stay awake. The kitchen, with the chairs pulled properly up to the table, was quiet and behaved as if nothing were amiss. He sat there, his napkin still square, the knife still a thread's width from the cutting board, his gaze looking past someone's shoulder toward the space between 2 ticks. On the far side of that space were white envelopes waiting to be opened, spreadsheets with empty rows, and some mourning that would need evidence. But for now, there was only dinner arriving at its quietest passage, heavy as a drum no one strikes and everyone hears. In the morning, the mailbox on the porch gave a dry, metallic clink, springing lightly in the river wind. Amid the faded flyers was a thicker envelope, gray-blue paper, with a line of deep blue lettering in the upper left. The SISA envelope had arrived early. He picked it up and weighed it in his hand for a moment, as if measuring his own heartbeat. The smell of new paper threading through the cold metal smell of the porch. He didn't tear it open. In the kitchen, he found the butter knife and slit along the sealed edge in a clean line, separating the paper without a ragged tooth. The notice slid out, evenly printed, dates tidy, the numbers standing straight backed like small pillars. He exhaled longer than on other mornings, a thin warmth just enough to keep his heart from knocking against his breastbone. The familiar road to the bank ran along the river, the pavement still white with last night's salt. The bank's glass revolving door pushed inward, the rubber gasket meeting the frame with the faintest squeak. People stood in line, heavy coats on, gloves taken off and held in hand. On the glass counter, the money counter ran steadily, a red LED blinking in time, the rubber tongues flicking across the bill edges with a fine tack, which merged into a smooth, continuous flow. Overhead lights fell onto the glass, reflecting the teller's cheekbones and a stray gray hair among her black. When it was his turn, he set the papers on the sliding tray. His other hand rested lightly on the counter's edge, the knuckles flattened like paving stones. The teller looked them over, eyes moving along the figures, gave a small nod. She slid the envelope back with the receipt, her voice lowered by habit to keep the other person's privacy. Rest is also a part of labor. He only nodded, no spoken thanks. His nod was enough, like a small nail driven deep into wood. The counter ran again, separating bills, gathering bills, then stopped on a round number. The new, cold bills touched his hand, their surface faintly rough. He didn't recount them aloud. He let his thumb run along the edge of each bill, listening to the fine fotch, the way a craftsman taps the planks he's set to make sure none are loose. The receipt, printed in hot black ink, still smelled faintly, its edge curling from the heat. He folded it in half, slipped it into his inside pocket, the ink breath warming against the cloth. On the way home, wind off the river struck his collar. The dark water sliced the thin reflections of streetlights. He held his coat close, not for fear of cold, but to keep the thrum of the new bills in his pocket moving in step with his footfalls. Back at the porch, the bulb over the door still flickered bright for a beat longer than usual, as if it meant to stay and then fell still. The step gave a very soft sound as he put his full weight on one foot, and then stopped, as if quieted by a wordless promise. In the kitchen, he pulled open the right-hand drawer where the dish towels were stacked. A folded sweater lay in the middle, still holding the smell of dry wood, the long smell of winter and of hands. He lifted the sweater, placed the roll of cash beneath the fold, smoothed it flat so it lay still like a spine. Beneath that was his wife's old mail tin, a red-painted tin box with a small white scar where the paint had chipped, the lid held by a worn latch. He set a fingertip on the box's back and felt the coolness go into his skin. Money on the sweater, sweater on the tin of memory, 3 quiet layers stacked, like a porch roof newly braced with one more cross beam. He pushed the drawer in so it closed softly without a sound. People say money lightens the shoulders, but for him, the lightness came from order. Papers in the binder, receipts in the envelope, cash under the sweater. He took the manila binder from the table, opened the 2 rings, and filed the bank receipt under a new penciled tab. SSA, this month. The metal hinge gave a decisive, gentle click. The binder's spine meeting the tabletop sounded solid, like a craftsman's knuckle on a nail just driven home. His back loosened a little. The ridge between his shoulder blades no longer cinched tight as usual. The kettle on the stove had cooled. He poured what remained into a cup, dropped in a tea bag, a light herbal scent threading into the leftover smell of coffee. He took a sip and set the cup on the same old ring on the tabletop, watched it sit flush like a round stamp pressed over the previous round stamp. At the top of the expense ledger page, he added the date, the total, a fine dash. No annotation, no exclamation. At the bottom, he left a blank space, a place for the payables to file in their proper order without crowding. He glanced out the window over the sink. The river still moved along its heavy course, but in the kitchen the wall clock seemed half a beat farther away. On the refrigerator, The red circles he'd drawn on the bus schedule looked less harsh. The felt tip pin was still clipped beneath the magnet, its tip turned downward, the ink promising clear red strokes on some near day. Hope, it turned out, was not a flare. It was like a regular porch light once the socket had been tightened, steady, giving just enough so the latecomer wouldn't stumble. He closed the binder and pressed his hand lightly on the cover. His hand's shadow lay on the board for a second and then was gone, leaving the pale yellow surface looking untouched. In his breast pocket, the receipt warmed to his body heat. In the drawer, under the sweater, the money lay silent as a consent already signed, needing no proclamation. He pulled out a chair and sat up straight, his eyes resting on the pencil line on the previous page. From now on, no more adding the word save. Right behind that sentence, hope had just flickered small, unshowy, but enough for him to hear his breath lengthen and even out. Somewhere in town, the money counters were running steadily again, and in the small kitchen, an old man had placed his life into the proper folds, sweater cashed in and a binder latched shut. Morning entered the house like a cold pane of glass, pressed to the forehead. He opened the right-hand drawer, the place where last night he had put the money beneath the sweater, his hands still warm from just holding the teacup. No wood creak, no hinges groan, only a hollow space opening up. The sweater's fabric still held its flat fold, the crease intact like a sheet of water no one has yet disturbed. Beneath it lay the bare wooden bottom. Only $17 remained. A few loose coins rolled to the corner, tapped the wooden side with a tiny thock, then went still. No pry marks, no scratches. The fine dust along the drawer's sides still ran straight in the old lines, unswept by any finger. He did not breathe hard. He stood a long time, his forefinger touching the wood grain, the pulse in his wrist showing under the skin like a small fish newly stranded. First light poured down from the window over the sink, white and thin, making everything show exactly its cold edge. His wife's tin mailbox lay quiet on the lower level, the lid shut, the chipped edge of paint still white like a streak of salt. He set the sweater back in its place, smoothed its back once, and heard the yarn rasp against dry wood like wind touching the eaves. The kitchen door opened a crack. His son leaned on the counter, left hand set on the stone edge, his thumb tapping a light beat. He didn't come all the way in. A thin smile touched one corner of his mouth and stayed there, like a pencil mark not yet erased. The light picked out the stubble along his jaw and the rectangle of a phone screen weighing in his pocket. He tilted his head toward the drawer the old man had just closed, asked nothing. When he spoke, his voice passed through a layer of cold air, and touched the old man's ear like sliding metal across glass. Call it rent. The two words rent money dropped onto the floor like a stone not large, but heavy enough for a foot to trip. At that moment, the little one's glass of milk gave a shake. The plastic straw popped out, the glass fell slowly, a white smear spreading across the tabletop, the milk crawling through the tablecloth's pattern and then falling by the chair to draw a thick curve on the tile. The thud of the glass hitting the floor wasn't loud, but it rang out like a verdict already stamped. The child started, eyes gone round, looked at the white streak creeping, then looked to him. The daughter-in-law reached quickly for napkins, but her hand checked for a beat, as if not knowing where to begin. He reached for the dish towel hanging on the hook by the sink. It was still wet from last night's dinner. The cold cloth bit into his palm. He twisted it, a thin run of water squeezing out to patter into the sink. The pulse at his wrist pushed small beats into the cloth's edge, making it quiver in his hand. He bent down, set the towel on the milk streak, drew it slowly along, his fingers gripping the fabric until the knuckles went white. On the tile, the white trail thinned and turned into a damp film, leaving a slightly rough border. He wiped again, a little harder this time, as if to pull along with it a new smell that had slipped into the kitchen, the smell of humiliation mixed with leftover grease out of the room. His son was still leaning on the counter. He looked over the old man's shoulder, then out to the porch, where the bulb still flickered like someone forcing their eyes to stay open. The smile didn't change. There were no more words. The daughter-in-law folded the milk-soaked napkins into a small wad and dropped them into the trash. The lid fell and clipped the plastic with a clack. The older child pulled the milk glass toward himself, lips pressed, wiped the milk at his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Everything was tidy, clean, as if nothing worthy of a name had just happened. The drawer was closed, but the hollow sound stayed in the kitchen, like the sound of a fresh niche cut in a wall, not yet plastered. He stood upright, wrung the towel nearly dry, rolled his wrist once to put it back into its old groove. His heart beat hard, each thump clear, lifting his shirt a touch at the breast pocket. His mouth stayed shut. He knew that if any sound slipped out, it would shatter like a thin glass into pieces, harder to clean up than the milk streak had been. The wall clock kept ticking, its rhythm unmoved by the loss of money. The minute hand had just passed the thick mark, leaving a shadow on the glass, and then letting it go. The refrigerator's compressor kicked on, a faint vibration running across the tabletop. Down along the table legs, the water ring around the glass from earlier had thinned, leaving a pale outline like an old ring mark on the hand of someone grown lean. He laid the towel across the lip of the sink, straightening it so it covered evenly. The towel's edge squared to the steel edge. His son pushed off from the counter. His heel touched the floor with a sound as small as the damping of a final note. Passing by the old man, he tugged his hem straight and brushed the door chime hanging on a hook. The chime trembled once, but made no sound, wrapped in a strip of cloth tape. The back door opened. A seam of cold air slid in from the porch, slapped along the old man's sleeve, and went out at the wrist where the pulse still knocked. The faint smell of river water paid a brief visit and moved on. He turned back to the drawer again, like someone returning to a step just missed. The sweater was still smooth, the tins still quiet. He didn't touch them. He only closed the drawer with a gentler hand, letting it come flush without a slam. His hand was still damp. A dim water print lingered on the pull and then disappeared. On the table, the morning coffee cup still sat on the same old ring, but the coffee had gone cold. He didn't warm it. He drew out a chair and sat, laying both hands open on his thighs like two empty trays. The kitchen light was whiter now, showing the suspended threads of dust. Among those dust motes, the sentence from a moment ago hung suspended, hadn't dropped to the floor, hadn't blown out the door. Call it rent. It went around, brushed the frame of the picture on the wall, grazed the edge of the manila binder farther off, and hid in the seam between two boards of the tabletop. He looked straight at that seam for the length of 3 breaths, then shifted his gaze to the calendar with the red circles on the fridge. The circles hadn't changed color. They only seemed half a step farther away. The younger child came back to the table and slid a straw into another glass. The straw made a hollow sound like wind passing a bottle. The daughter-in-law rinsed the fallen glass quickly. The water struck the inner wall bright and clear. She set the glass on the rack and drops fell evenly to the stainless tray. Everything went back to ordinary as people set things right after a slip of the hand, with no one mentioning the slip. He reached toward the coffee cup, stopped midway, and drew back his hand. It changed course, passed over the old wallet, and pulled it closer to the table's edge, as if to cover a bit of bare skin. No one looked. He sat straight, the nape of his neck stiffening like wood under old paint. His heart still pounded, but it had found a place to keep a steadier rhythm, like the money counter yesterday, except today the machine ran inside his chest and issued no receipt. His mouth was still shut. His silence wasn't surrender. It was only to keep a word from springing out and vanishing like steam on glass. No one can hold on to it. Through the rear door's pane, the porch bulb flickered again. A brief blink, then a pause as if weighing, then out. In the kitchen, the smells of milk still drifted, the smell of a towel just wrung, the smell of an old dry sweater. He set his palm on the tabletop, slowly pressed it so the skin's warmth bled into the wood. The mute barrier, it turned out, was not a wall set upright, but a run of fine lines connecting the empty drawer to the white streak of milk and onto a thin sentence. They stood in their places without noise, so the broken bits showed themselves plainly enough that, if one only looked up, anyone could see. But he did not look up. He waited for his heartbeat to ebb, drew back his hand, and folded the napkin once more. to a truer square. The rest he set it beneath, the way he had laid the sweater over the old tin box, silent but in order, but in peace. The library at the end of the street opened with a familiar sound. The bell, fixed to the wooden frame, quivered softly, without lingering. The air in the lobby was a little warmer than outside, wrapping him in the smell of old paper, printer's ink, and the kind of wax used to polish floors. The entry mat drank in the dry snowmelt from shoes, leaving speckled gray marks. At the returns counter, the date stamp ink pad sat open, the rubber pad having printed a purple blot on a tissue. In the children's corner hung strings of paper pennants. A small armchair upholstered with a teddy bear print had sunk a little from much use. The radiators breathed steadily beneath the windows, their warmth fogging a strip of glass where a Read Together Saturday poster had been taped. He walked slowly along the wooden floor, worn glossy down the middle, holding the manila binder close to his body as if for warmth. His other hand was in his coat pocket, the knuckles still cinched from the morning. At the counter, the librarian, May, pinned on a little metal badge, looked up. She was close to 60, her hair a tidy coil of black, shot with gray, thin frames hanging from a fine cord around her neck, the old wedding ring having left a mark around her finger, though it had been taken off. Her eyes had the clear brightness of someone who sleeps well, without prying. In a single exchanged glance, he felt as if he had passed by a flat mirror. She pulled open the drawer under the counter and took out a clear plastic sleeve, its corners rounded, the material thick enough not to crack at the edge. Beside it, she set a stainless steel binder clip, the kind with two small black ears that can be folded down to lie flat. Then, as if remembering something, she bent to another drawer and pulled from a stack of flyers one that read County Senior Support, Free Counseling, a phone number faintly printed at the bottom corner. She drew a ballpoint from the pocket of her knit cardigan and wrote another line of numbers by hand along the white margin, an even script, slightly slanted blue ink. When she laid the flyer on the counter, she cupped her hand over it so it wouldn't lift in the draft from the door just swung shut. "So the papers don't get lost," she said quietly. The voice went across the wood of the counter like a fingertip smoothing a thread of dust. No further questions. He nodded, the nod of someone who has used nods in place of thank yous for a very long time. He opened the binder, the two silver rings yawning, a white gap. From his inside pocket, he took the bank receipt envelope, still warm with ink, slipped the paper into the clear sleeve she had given him, pressed the edges flush. The binder clip bit across the corner with a tiny metallic click. The pension statements, the SSA appointment slips, the photos of the house before the title transfer, the porch roof repair receipts, each sheet found its new home beneath the flat plastic. His finger followed the edges, smoothing the small bubbles outward until the surface lay unruffled. May stepped back half a pace, giving him space. Beside her, the barcode scanner beeped now and then as someone returned books. At the long table behind, a boy in a gray hoodie bent over his homework, his pencil tapping an odd beat on the page's edge. An elderly woman turned a newspaper, the paper rustling but soft. No one looked at the stack of papers in his hands longer than necessary. The quiet here wasn't emptiness. It was a thick cloth that stops the wind, enough for a person to lash back down the things about to come loose. He brought the flyer closer to his eyes. The words County Senior Support were printed on a pale yellow background that didn't glare, like the color of book covers that have passed through many hands. Her handwritten number lay across the lower margin. The blue ink wasn't quite dry, catching the light in a tiny glossy point. He folded the flyer in half without crushing the crease and slid it into the front pocket of the binder, the place he kept for escape routes if the power went out. His fingertip brushed the pocket stitching, felt the faint roughness of even regular seams, the patience of a craftsman. A nudge of wind at the door set the bell ringing again, a soft metallic touch like a spoon meeting a porcelain plate at home. He closed the binder, the two rings meeting. The click sounded clearer than anything else he had heard all morning. Not loud, but exactly placed, like someone setting a round period at the end of a line. That click stayed in his chest like a promise spoken to himself, needing no formal words. May handed him a small library tote, the kind meant for people who borrow a lot of books, so the binder wouldn't slip from his grasp. But she didn't say it. She only eased the bag toward him, her hand leaving the counter for half a breath. He received it and lowered the binder inside. The cloth rasped softly against the manila with a warm, fibrous sound. He thanked her with another nod, a shade deeper. He stood a moment longer. On the community board by the door, a slip of paper pinned with a red tack read, "Tax Class for Seniors, Thursday." Beneath it, the children's activities calendar showed a drawing of a river and little paper fish. A donation envelope sat at the corner of the counter, just heavy enough not to be lifted by the wind. He didn't reach for it. Not now. He only looked at it the way one looks at an empty chair at home, fixing its place in mind. May drew a tissue and wiped a faint track of dust along the counter's edge, the motion slow and sure. When she lifted her head, her glance passed over the binder inside his tote and came to rest briefly on the pencil line he had once written on its spine, "File by year." She gave the slightest nod, the nod of someone acknowledging that an order has been put in its proper place. Then she turned to stamp the date in a book someone had just returned. The DU stamp touched paper with a sound dry but gentle. He left the counter and walked past the nonfiction shelves, the spines standing like straight planks. With each step, the cloth bag brushed his thigh, reminding him of the weight within. Through the window, the riverbank showed as a long gray strip, leafless crowns shivering in the wind. But in here, the heat held steady, and the smell of ink dulled the metallic scent brought in on people's clothes. Before pushing the door, he paused to adjust the strap and pull the binder down to lie flat. His hand rested on the manila for a beat, as if hammering one more small hook into the wall inside his chest. The bell rang again as he went out. The cold hit his face, stinging his eyes for a moment, but the earlier click still sounded thinly somewhere inside him, keeping his back from sagging. The binder lay quiet in the tote, the folded flyer in the front pocket, the steel clip clamped tight on the paper's corner. So the papers don't get lost. Her short sentence was like a seam stitch locking the edge of a hem. What needed asking would have a place to be asked. And for now, he was taking home a new way of keeping order. A clear plastic sleeve, a binder clip, a flyer with a handwritten number, and a click just enough to tell a day gone astray from a day standing upright. The gas station's glass door slid open, the bell overhead giving a thin chime. The pallid green of fluorescent lights lay over the candy racks, the row of pre-brewed coffee, and the black rubber mat worn smooth down the middle. The thin smell of gasoline mixed with the hot paper scent of a freshly printed receipt. He stepped in, hugging the library tote strapped to his side. The binder inside thumped softly against his thigh with each step, as if to remind him it was still there. The night shift clerk looked up, hair tied neat. When she finished counting change, she pushed the plastic tray back in. Before he said anything, she had already pulled out a stack of thin napkins, took one, folded it in half, and then in quarters, and set it beside an empty paper coffee cup. "It's cold tonight. Keep the coffee hot longer," she said softly, as if afraid to wake the wind at the door. Nothing more. Her hand slid the plastic lid toward him, her thumb touching the snap with a soft little click. He poured black coffee from his thermos. The steam blurred an old circular mark on the counter's glass. He capped the cup and wrapped the napkin around it like a coat, tucking the end beneath the cardboard sleeve printed with the station's logo. A small, sure gesture. Heat seeped from the cup into joints gone cold, ran along his palm, and stopped at the wrist like a punctuation mark. He laid a few coins on the glass, took the small receipt still warm with ink. The printer rattled in staccato and ended with a hush like an exhale. Outside, pump number 3 clicked as someone squeezed the handle. A large truck idled slow, its body shuddering, the headlights skewing up the plastered wall to bare patches. He hoisted the tote to his shoulder, the other hand holding the napkin-wrapped cup. Before pushing back through the door, he carefully slid the receipt into the binder's small pocket, not because it was important, but because lately every scrap of paper needed a place to stay put. River wine slapped his collar the instant the sliding door closed behind him. The smell of old water and damp metal slipped inside his heavy coat and bit cold at the nape. He raised the collar, lifted the cup to his mouth, and didn't drink. He only let the warmth of the coffee heat his skin. The sidewalk heaved with leftover clumps of stamped-on snow. Along the metal fence, the construction company's little plastic flags fluttered hard, like shivering. Across the street, the river lay dark, its surface chewing the lights into broken pieces. He walked in even steps, listening to the tote strap whisper against his sweater. In the pawn shop's shuttered front, a small pane reflected his figure, a body not bent. Shoulders level, a coffee cup held in both hands like something warm and fragile. He paused a beat before the newspaper vending box, looking at the cold headlines lined straight, then moved on. At the corner, the old phone booth stood misplaced like a mailbox with no mail. Inside, numbers for services to disappear and to call back were layered over one another, black and red ink crowding like a quarrel. The river wind shifted, went straight down his collar so a small point of cold soaked the skin. He changed the cup to his left hand, gripped the tote strap with his right. His fingers touched the binder's hard edge through the fabric. In there, in the binder, was the one thing the wind couldn't knock awry: paper. He didn't form a sentence, but the feeling of a weight, with true weight at his side, not judging, not changing its mind, only needing to be stacked straight and opened at the right time, made his footfalls sound louder on the concrete. The turnoff toward home opened up. Leafless trees pressed close like posts holding up a low sky. The wind blew hard. He lowered his head a touch, his breath turning into small coils of smoke that dissolved quickly. The napkin-wrapped cup was still hot, the thin napkin doing the work of a lining, stretching a few minutes of warmth like a quiet addition. The clerk's words drifted through his mind. Keep the coffee hot longer. He thought, some things only need to stay warm a little longer to make it home. The wooden gate into the front yard gave a short squeal as he pushed through. The steps were blotched with salt. He stopped, not putting his foot on the step yet. The porch bulb blinked once, held, blinked again, like the eyes of a tired person trying to open wide. The wavering yellow made the wooden handrail change shade, now darker, now lighter. He stood there, the draft running along his jaw, cold touching straight to the teeth. His hand gripped the rail, his palm still warm from the cup. Beside the door, the little hanging chime kept still, its strip of cloth wrapped to keep it from ringing. A car passed on the street and the headlights swept across the porch, pulling his shadow long along the wall and then swallowing it. The porch bulb flickered again, weak as a pulse at the wrist seen through a damp cloth, and in that thin on and off blink, he saw all the recent evenings more clearly, small things set in the wrong place, thin words that cut deep, the milk trail, the empty drawer, the tilted smile. No more words were needed to understand that anything spoken aloud would only make the wind blow harder. He raised the cup and took a sip, let the warm bitterness pass over his tongue, touch his throat, and go down to where the heart beat. His other hand touched the binder's edge inside the tote. The stiffness was like a crossbeam set into a weak porch roof, not showy, but enough to stand a gust. He knew he would have to set the papers in order, call things by their right names, arrange dates like laying treads on a step. No one needs to argue with the click of a steel clip, with black ink on a receipt with a dated photo of a porch roof. They speak for themselves. The wind went through his collar again, low and cold. He set the cup on the first step so the warmth from its base could pass into the cold wood, making a small round mark. He looked at that circle. It was like the one on the kitchen table each morning when he set his cup down. A repeated stamp, steady. The porch bulb flickered once more and then held steady for a few seconds, long enough for him to notice a white streak of salt still clinging to the door handle. He pulled the napkin from his pocket, the spare the clerk had tucked in, and wiped the salt, folded the napkin and slipped it into his coat, a small act, but it cleared a corner of the view. He stood a moment more, not from tiredness, only to let his breathing catch up to the porch light's effort to hold steady. It's time to let the evidence speak. The thought came without a sound. It only set a finger on his shoulder and pressed lightly, as if to say, go on in. He lifted the cup and opened the door. Warmth from inside slid out and wrapped the porch cold. Behind him, the porch light, for now, stopped its flicker and shone the right kind of yellow, the kind that keeps a latecomer from stumbling. And ahead were the wooden table, the binder, the steel clips that make their click at the right time. Those things would speak for him now. He cleared the tabletop the way one clears an old step. The tablecloth was smoothed flat. The brown ring left by a coffee cup sat there as a quiet marker. The manila binder opened, the two silver rings parting their mouths. He drew the stack of papers closer and arranged them along the path of time. At the bottom, the old statements. Then the receipt for the porch roof repair in the rainy season 2 years ago. Then the before photo of the porch with its swaying bulb and the handrail gone dull gray, and the after photo with the roof replaced, the crossbeam bright with new wood. On top lay the copy of the house papers, the upper corner stamped "Received." The ink faded with the years. Each sheet he smoothed with the back of his hand, nudging the edges flush. At the corners of the important sheets, he made a tiny fold, just enough for a moistened fingertip to find next time. The pencil tapped lightly at the margin. Month and year, place shot, carpenter's name, receipt number. The click of the steel clip closing sounded like a wood joint slipping into place. The papers moved from left to right, old to new, like breath traveling from chest to belly and out again. Order didn't raise its voice. It simply set everything upright. He pulled a ruled sheet of white paper and laid it alone in the center of the table. This was the letter. In the upper left corner, he entered the date. On the right, he wrote the recipient's address in clear uppercase, without ornament. The tone he copied down was not heavy-handed, confirmation that funds had been misused, a demand for repayment by a deadline, a request to cease the appropriation of the pension, and a date set for a reconciliation with a witness at the house, with a list of documents to bring. No words to humiliate anyone, only markers, sums, times, and a final line. Please respond in writing. After each paragraph, he set down the pen, hearing it travel over the paper like a young saw through soft grain. At the edge, he listed the appendices, this month's statement, the bank receipt, the porch photos, before-after, the copy of the house papers, the copy of the porch roof repair receipt. Each line was a hook. At the bottom of the page, he left a blank space exactly as wide as his index finger, the place for a signature. He uncapped a blue ink pen and dabbed a little on the notebook cover before signing so the ink would run evenly. The signature was small, slanted slightly, like a thread laid across a seam. The ink was still wet, reflecting the kitchen light in a trembling streak. He laid the pen flat for a few seconds, listened to the refrigerator's compressor kick on, then capped it. A white envelope lay ready, the inside lined with pale blue security striping. He wrote the recipient's address in straight, square-cornered strokes. Beneath it, the line, certified/registered in bold. In the upper left, he printed his own address, spacing the letters by eye. The letter was folded in thirds, the crease running clean through the lines without biting into a word. As he slid it into the envelope, his fingertip traced the edge to flatten it, pushing all the paper fully inside so no corner protruded. He sealed the flap and smoothed the gum from the center outward. His fingertips trembled slightly, not from fear, but because the blood was running faster in his veins. He smoothed it a second time, wiped the gum line clean with his thumb, leaving a faint damp halo that dried away. He set the certified mail slip and the pale green return receipt card beside the envelope and filled the boxes one by one. Recipient's name, address, zip code. The return receipt requested box he marked with a small check. The handwriting was even, with just enough white space. He affixed the slip along the guide stripe on the front of the envelope, smoothed it flat, avoiding air bubbles. On the table, the strip of clear tape flashed back a bright line, like a thin thread of water. The binder opened once more. The table of contents he had made yesterday waited for a new line. He wrote, certified letter, demand for repayment and reconciliation date, with the date. From the first pocket, the one labeled new receipts, he drew out a blank sheet already marked tracking number so he could fill it in when he got home, and clipped it in with a small clip. Writing in a space for a number not yet in hand loosened his chest by a notch. It was like putting up a hook on the wall before bringing the coat home. He stood, went to the other room for his heavy coat, came back, and cleared the table. The papers were in the binder. What remained were a few pencil eraser crumbs and a thread that had fallen from the edge of the library tote. He flicked the thread into his palm and tossed it in the trash with the spare bit of tape. The cold coffee cup was set squarely onto the faint ring on the table, a familiar stamp pressed over a familiar stamp. In the kitchen, the light had softened, and warmth from the heater threaded along the floor. He slung the tote over his shoulder and took the envelope in his other hand. That hand closed around the thin but firm object, the feel of paper, with its proper weight. Before leaving the kitchen, he set the binder on the table once more and laid his palm on the spine, the way one might touch the backbone of an old friend. "Stay here." Then he turned to the calendar on the fridge. The red circle marking the bus route to the post office at noon was already there. He pulled the felt tip from beneath the magnet and drew a thin line in the afternoon slot as a backup if the queue was too long. The pen tip returned a soft, scratchy sot on the paper. When he opened the back door, the cold bit at the rim of his ear. He tucked his hand into his sleeve for a second, then reached out again and gripped the envelope. On the porch, the bulb flickered once and then held steady just long enough for him to lock the door. The step made no sound. The nails were tight. On the narrow road to the bus stop, he kept the envelope pressed to the fabric of his coat, hearing a faint rustle like last night's spoon against the porcelain plate. This was not a sentence handed down. This was a gentle key turning in the right lock, putting things back where they belong, money to where money goes, boundaries to where boundaries go, the appointment set in a single clear line under the light. And as he passed through the gate, the blue ink signature inside the envelope had dried completely, leaving on the paper a calm line like the river's surface when the wind settles. Night came slow and thick, like a layer of wax laid over the house. He switched on the kitchen light. The gentle yellow poured down onto the wood he had wiped dry that afternoon. On the table, the old ring from the morning coffee cup still left a faint halo, like a marker that needed no erasing. He hung his coat behind the door, pushed the sleeves of his sweater up past his wrists, and pulled from the small drawer the machine oil he used for hinges and a short-handled screwdriver. The kitchen door cracked open, and the fine squeak at the hinge showed itself like a loose thread. He tilted the bottle and let fall drop after drop, each one landing right in the iron joint, round and full before it soaked in. He opened and closed the door a few times, listening to the resistance draw down like someone exhaling. Metal and oil found each other. The squeak turned into a soundless glide. He wiped the excess with a cloth, folded the cloth again, its edges square like a small confirmation. Starting tomorrow, the opening door won't startle anyone mid-sentence. Out on the porch, the late winter wind threaded the gaps between the balusters, carrying the smell of river water and damp metal. He brought out a chair to stand on and twisted the bulb out of its socket, the glass body cold like a stone in his hand. In the socket, a thin crust of salt clung like chalk. He rubbed it lightly with a dry paper and screwed in a new bulb. A soft flick of his finger at the switch, the yellow light flared and held steady. He looked at it a little longer than usual, not to check, but to remember the feeling of light when it no longer flickers. The beam fell across the steps, covering the small scratches in the wood with a calm, warm layer. He came back in, drew the kitchen door to the hinge, now spoke only in a touch and tidied the tabletop again, though it was already clean. The cloth moved in wide circles. The water wrung out before he set it in the basin. The grain ran straight, shining where his fingers had paused the longest. He pulled out 2 chairs and set them parallel to the table, their backs in line with the edge. One faced the place where he always sat. The other was angled a little, near enough to hear, far enough to breathe. He shifted the chair legs slightly so they wouldn't strike the chipped tile, avoiding an unexpected sound tomorrow. The manila binder lay to the left, opened like a road already ruled. He checked the index. The clear sleeves kept the papers flat as water. From left to right, statements, porch roof receipts, before, after photos, copies of the house papers, a photocopy of the certified letter, and a blank sheet marked New Receipts. He had tabbed each section with a small note, uppercase letters, the tab edge just brushing the margin, month, date, signature. He set a blue ink pen parallel to the spine, a short pencil laid crosswise, and a spare steel clip lying flat like an anchor. He put a kettle on. The small ticking of bubbles threaded itself between the heater's steady breathing. When the water hissed up a thin ribbon of steam, he turned it off and warmed a porcelain cup. He poured half a cup of coffee and capped it with the familiar ceramic lid to keep the heat. That cup he set in the open space at the right edge of the table, where the other chair waited, its handle turned outward so an unfamiliar hand could take it without fumbling. In front of the cup, he placed a quarter-folded paper napkin, white and dry, the portion for the one who would need to sit still and listen to the papers. He didn't pour for himself. He wanted to keep that coffee for the person who would have to drink it to steady their breath. He looked around the kitchen the way a craftsman looks over his shop after hours of repair. On the wall, the clock still marked each notch without hurry. The sink was dry. The dish towel hung evenly. The trash had its bag tied and stood near the back door, ready for a day when there would be extra paper to throw away. On the refrigerator, the red circle around tomorrow morning's time slot stood still like a point of reference. The felt-tip pin was still clipped under the magnet, tip pointing down, promising to write round and clear when another mark was needed. He drew up a chair and tried sitting in the one opposite the guest's place. From here, the path the papers would take was plain to see. Open the binder and lay out the first page. Point to the date. Point to the name, point to the photo, pass the pen. No one needed to raise a voice. The eyes only needed to follow the lines. He leaned back, letting his chest test its breathing against the porch's new light, imagining even the silences that wouldn't chafe. Silence so the words arrive in order. Silence so a signature can fall to the page without shaking. His sweater brushed the chair back, the threads whisper like an old soothing. He stood and made a circuit of the porch. The new bulb held a steady yellow, throwing a band of light across the steps and bringing out the grain in the wood like calm currents. He bent and touched the handrail. It felt warmer than it had that afternoon. In the corner of the yard, packed snow that hadn't had time to melt hugged the fence posts. He went back inside, locked the door, tested the handle twice to be sure the latch didn't catch. The hinge was still smooth. Inside, he made himself a weak cup of tea. He didn't set it in the empty space beside the guest's coffee. He carried the tea to the window ledge, where a coin-sized chip of paint had peeled. He leaned his back against the sink and watched the minute hand pass the thick mark. Each tick from the clock was like driving a small nail into an invisible board hung in his chest. Tomorrow, at this time, the papers will speak. He drank half the cup and let the rest go cool, the lip of the glaze turning cold under his finger. Back at the table, he adjusted the binder's corner once more and drew the coffee cup a half-finger joint closer. He opened the drawer, took his wife's old tin teaks, and set it on the high shelf out of reach of hurried hands. Not to hide it, only so it wouldn't crowd its voice into the conversation of the papers. He turned out the extra lights, leaving only the kitchen and porch lamps. The light came through the door edge in two parallel bands, meeting at the place where the coffee sat, like two ruled lines bracketing a line of text. Night had settled for good. The river's sound in the distance lay like a long, even, quiet breath. In the small kitchen, everything was in its place. The hinges oiled, the bulb steady, the wooden table dry, the chairs set in a straight line, the binder open toward the light, a cup of coffee keeping warm for the one who would soon need it. He stood at the threshold and let his palm rest against the tabletop one last beat, like a blessing that tomorrow might proceed in the gentlest order possible. Then he switched off the kitchen light. Only the porch lamp stayed a steady yellow meant to guide a tired person over the step without stumbling, enough for the truth to come into the house without having to slip. Afternoon entered the house as a thin band of light. The porch lamp held steady. The kitchen door opened smoothly. The hinges had been oiled the night before. The witness arrived right on time, wiped her heels on the mat, gave a slight nod, then sat one chair back as agreed. On the table, the manila binder laid crosswise, the blue ink pen parallel to the spine, the spare steel clip lying flat like an anchor. At the right edge, the guest's cup of coffee was still hot, a quarter-folded napkin set beneath it. The wall clock ticked steadily. He drew the binder closer and opened the two silver rings. Papers moved from left to right. First came the proof of mailing, the pale green certified mail slip, the tracking strip affixed at the corner, the number in bold. The return receipt bore the date of delivery, stamped the black ink dry, the letters square. He set it down to the left, squared with the table's edge. His fingertip touched the post office's round seal, a ring of ink like a screw already tight in the wood. Next was the transfer reconciliation table, a column for date, a column for amount, a column for description. Any row that was off, he scored with a fine pencil stroke in the margin. Any row that matched, he marked with a small, dry, final dot. The sheet rasped as he turned it sideways for easier reading. He set a plastic ruler along the edge, slid it down the date column, and paused at repeated points. Light from the window perched on the paper's surface, making the figures rise slightly like grains of rice. The porch photos carried dates at the bottom of the frame, one before, the bulb swaying, the handrail dulled, the steps blotched with salt. One after, a new socket shining steady yellow, the crossbeam clean-grained, the screw head still edged with tiny burrs. He placed the two photos side by side, their lower edges touching one straight line, with the porch repair receipt in a clear sleeve between them. He smoothed out the air bubbles with his fingertip until the plastic lay flat as water. The witness jotted a few lines in her notebook, the ballpoint whispering a light shk across the page. The copy of the house papers lay on top. The received stamp in the upper right faded with the years. He opened the clip, slipped it in, and shut it. The steel gave a small click that matched a beat of the clock. The pension statement for this month lay beneath, the total in bold, the deposit posting on the right date. He slid the bank receipt thermal paper, slightly curled with warmth, alongside, edges aligned. No one raised a voice. The son sat opposite, his back not quite touching the chair. His phone lay face down and still. His right hand left the table's edge and came to rest on his knee. His index finger tapped his trouser seam once and stopped, his lips pressed together. His eyes followed the path of the papers, sometimes lingering on the mailing proof, sometimes skimming the amount column. Each time the old man turned a page, the phone's dark screen caught and then lost, a thin band of window light. The witness sat back, holding the agreed distance. She set her coffee cup on the coaster, leaving a pale brown ring of damp. She did not interject. Now and then we lifted her pen, drew a short line in her notebook, capped it, and uncapped it again. The gesture was regular, unshowy, but enough to remind the room that a third set of eyes was present. He flipped to the binder's self-made table of contents. Under reconciliation, he added another bullet in pencil. Date, time, present. He wrote no names, only witness. The pencil rasped on the paper, a dry, light sound. He set the ruler to the edge and checked once more the dates in the transfer table against the posting dates on the statement. His finger passed over each box like counting nails on a plank. Out on the porch, river wind swept once through the door seam. The little hanging chime, wrapped with tape, did not ring. Inside, the heater shifted cycles, its tone lower. The clock's smooth hand kept on, like a light hammer testing a frame. No one pushed a chair. No one breathed hard. If any sound stood out, it was paper touching paper, a fingertip tapping a photo corner, the soft rasp of a sleeve as the order changed. The row of documents had become a row. Left, proof of mailing confirmation of delivery. Middle, reconciliation confirmation of where the money went and where it went wrong. Right, dated porch photos, confirmation of what was repaired and why. On top, the copy of the house papers, confirmation of title. At the bottom, this month's statement confirmation of source. Every Y was replaced by done, every maybe not by black ink. He nudged the blue ink pen toward the table's edge, parallel to the blank receipt form he had plead but not yet offered. The witness closed her notebook for a second and opened it again, the way one takes a breath before writing the next item. The son adjusted his posture, back touching the chair, head slightly bowed. At the hollow of his throat, a pulse could be seen where the light fell at a slant. On the refrigerator, the red circles on the bus schedule were faintly visible through the kitchen door left ajar. The porch lamp did not flicker. The hinge did not speak. In this warm enough room, a reconciliation proceeded along its proper path. No need for a high voice. When he straightened his back, set his pencil tip to the edge of the reconciliation sheet, and drew a fine line to mark the end of the reading, that small scritch folded into the clock's tick like two parallel underlines beneath a sentence that now said, "Enough." He drew his hand back and rested it on the binder. The room held its stillness. No one raised a voice. Only the scrape of pen on paper and the clock's steady beat like a newly tightened bulb socket, light enough without jitter so whoever needed to see could see. The phone buzzed once. The vibration on the wooden tabletop sounded like a small insect crawling across, then stopping, then buzzing again. The screen lit up. The notification box showed a short, compact line, unshowy. Transfer 1.250 note. Schedule key handover. The blue light skimmed the rim of the coffee cup, the spine of the binder, then went dark. No one uttered a word. He tilted his head slightly to see the number without touching the phone. The witness lightly set the tip of her pen on her notebook, making a single dot in place of a full sentence. The son looked at the screen as if peering through the window of a familiar shop. Lips pressed, shoulders dropping by half a centimeter. In the notch of his throat, the pulse showed once and hid again. He pulled the pre-clipped receipt sheet out of the plastic sleeve. White paper, fine ruling, blanks he had already labeled in small letters. Received, date, amount, subject. He slid the sheet across to the other side, not with his fingertips, but with the back of his hand so as not to skew it. The blue ink pen sat ready, parallel to the paper's edge. No need to invite. The gesture was clear enough for anyone with eyes to see. The son reached for the pen. At the first instant, the nib touched the paper, but didn't move like a wheel caught on a pebble. Then it slid. A curved signature line appeared, checked for a beat at a corner, went on, small and even. The blue ink soaked into the paper's fibers, gleamed for half a second under the light, then dried. Beside the signature, he wrote the date. The numerals slightly slanted. In the subject box, he copied verbatim. Schedule key handover. No exclamation point, no quotation marks, only words. The witness drew her pen back, nodded very slightly, the pen tip tapping the cap with a soft T, like an acknowledgement. She pulled a copy toward herself, skimmed it, and placed it into her own clear sleeve. She did not say, "That's done," nor "good." She kept the space for the paper to go on doing its work. He received the signed receipt and slid it into the new receipts pocket at the front of the binder. His finger pinched the plastic edge and smoothed it flat. Tiny bubbles ran out, leaving a sleek surface. He set his pencil down at the table of contents and added a thin line. Receipt transfer, 1 note. Schedule key handover date. His writing was small, slanted, just legible. At the end of the line, he made a period. The period sat quiet like a small nail, just seated. In the kitchen, the heater shifted cycle. The clock ticked past the bold mark. Outside, the river wind passed along the porch switch, but the light did not flicker. The guest's coffee had cooled somewhat. The thin steam on its surface vanished quickly, leaving a gentle bitterness. The son slid his chair back. The chair legs made no screech thanks to the felt pads. He set the pen down parallel to the paper's edge, the nib pointed at no one. He gathered the papers. The mailing proof returned to the left, the reconciliation table to the center, the porch photos and the repair receipt clipped in the right order, the copy of the house papers on top. The plastic ruler slid along the top edge, raising an invisible straight line to keep everything square. He checked once more with his eyes, not with his fingers, then closed the 2 silver rings. Click. A small, clean sound that touched the sternum like a nod from within. The son's hand touched his thigh, smoothing the crease. His eyes skimmed past the binder and stopped at the untouched coffee. He didn't reach for it. The witness capped her pen, folded her notebook, and pulled the edge of her sweater up over her neck. On the refrigerator, the red circle for the morning bus to the bank was still there, like a mark laid on another day, needing no change. He raised a hand to the binder's edge and held it there for one beat. His fingernail touched the manila, polished smooth, like running a finger along the back of a familiar ruler, straight, plain, without ornament. He looked up, letting his eyes pass over the face opposite without lingering longer than needed. He searched for no words, no other sign. What needed to be heard had been heard in the form of letters. What needed to be seen had been seen in the form of stamps. He closed the binder all the way and set it on the table beside the cooled coffee. His wrist pressed down on the spine, like seating a final wooden brace. A slight nod, not a nod to forgive nor to prevail. It was a nod confirming that a new order had been laid down, run by ink and steel clips, without anyone needing to shove it. The phone on the table lit once more, the bank system's automatic reply recorded. The blue light skimmed across the tabletop like a small fish flicking above the surface and vanishing. No one touched it again. The witness stood, pushed her chair neatly back to the table. The son stood too, his hand on the chair back. The index finger tapped once and stopped. The clock kept ticking like footsteps crossing a wooden bridge with new crossbeams. Firm, without tremor, he seated the binder into the tote. The rasp of fabric against the cover sounded warmly rough, not cold like metal. He reached for the guest's coffee cup and turned the handle inward so it wouldn't be knocked when someone stood up. He glanced toward the porch. The yellow light was still steady. Every sign of a small storm just past had been wiped clean, not with a dishcloth, but with paper and ink. He turned toward the door, slid his own chair back into place, its edge aligned with the table's edge. His hand rested for a brief moment on the kitchen doorknob. The hinge was silent. No one said thank you. No one said sorry. There was only the smallest movement of objects. The pen left where it lay, the papers left where they lay, the binder closed, the light unwavering. And in the hollow left between two ticks of the clock, he stepped out of the kitchen by half a step, carrying that click as the cadence closing a chapter audible, not prolonged. Night lay over the town, quiet as a thick piece of cloth. On the porch, the lamp shone steady and yellow, done with flickering. The light no longer skipped. It poured evenly over the wooden handrail, the steps, the doormat with its frayed border. From the far riverbank, the wind came through once, touched the window pane, then dissolved like a sigh closing back in the throat. In the kitchen, the clock still ticked notch by notch, but the sound seemed to have stepped back half a pace. On the table, the manila binder lay still, its spine thickened by one segment. A new receipt had slipped into the clear plastic pocket, flat and cool. Each sheet had a black ink stamp in the corner, a date, a number. In the right-hand drawer, the envelope where he kept the little slips tracking stickers, postal forms, printed confirmations had thinned a little. With each transfer, what grew thin was not the money, but the room where old worries used to lodge. That thinning, oddly, made the kitchen feel larger. He ran warm water, set the cup in the basin. The dry sponge met water and swelled, giving a faint sound like grass breathing. The smell of cheap soap blended with the lingering scent of cold coffee into something clean but not cold. He washed the cup slowly, turning the glazed rim under the stream, letting the sound of the water cling to his palms like a small-scale piece of music. He set the cup to dry on a towel, blotted a ring around it, then lifted it and placed it exactly on the faint circle on the tabletop, a circle that had been there a long time, like a seal waiting for someone's return. The cup fit the mark neither off nor over. He opened the binder and skimmed the table of contents he had ruled by hand. Reconciliation receipt 1, receipt 2. At the bottom, a blank box was left for next time, its edge flagged with a small yellow sticky note. The short pencil lay at an angle, its point worn down close to the wood. He rolled it in his hand and made a light dot between two lines, like setting one more tiny nail into a beam. Everything was simple and orderly, papers into sleeves, tracking numbers into the column, dates into the row. No one needed to prove he was standing straight. The paperwork had done that job. He took the thin envelope from the drawer and counted the slips remaining inside. One postal form, two bank printouts, one handwritten note of his own about the bus time. The sound of paper touching paper was no longer sharp. It was calm, like pebbles laid along the edge of a garden. He slid the envelope back. His finger didn't have to search far. In the drawer, his wife's old tin box sat higher up, not crowding the business of today. It stood there as a quiet roof. The kitchen had its familiar sounds. The heater changing cycles, the refrigerator's compressor kicking on, a drop falling from the towel's edge to blur on the wood and disappear. On the refrigerator, the red circle marking a day next week was still clear, like a small buoy anchored on the surface, not tossed by waves. The felt tip pin clipped under the magnet lay still, its tip pointing down, ready for whatever line needed adding. On the chair opposite, an empty place lay still too. The cup reserved for the one who would need to sit quietly had been washed, dried, its handle turned inward, a perfect gesture for the afternoon just past and for other afternoons should they still come. He closed the binder and pressed his palm to the spine for a beat. The smoothness of the board, the slight rough of the manila edge, the dim cool of the clear plastic, all of it compressed under his hand like a straight length of wood set onto a frame. He did not think of winning or losing. Only the image came to mind of a smooth step, a porch light holding steady, and the decisive blue ink line where the afternoon's signature had dried into a muted stroke. In that place, the small storm had passed without knocking the table over. He pulled out a chair and sat exactly where he always sat. His spine touched the chair back naturally, without effort. His back was a little straighter, the straightness of a craftsman's hand when checking the last nail. He set both hands on the tabletop, fingertips meeting to form a small arch. That arch sheltered part of his heart. His breathing went deeper, stretched longer, without catching. Outside on the porch, the yellow stayed flat. Each time wind lifted the thin curtain, the lamp's shadow rocked lightly on the living room wall like a sleeping breath without dreams. He raised his eyes toward the window and saw the river's surface black as a thick pane of glass, chewing the streetlights into little fragments that burst and went out. Inside the house, the smell of dry wood grew stronger, the smell of a scrubbed step and of papers just opened. He took the expense ledger and opened to today's page. In the notes column, he drew a very fine line, shorter than usual, without annotation. A straight line not to strike anything out, but to remind him that something had been set in its place. He closed the ledger and tucked the pen into the spine. When he looked up, his eyes met the small photo of his wife, tucked in the wallet on the table, her head tilted as if listening for the kettle's boil. He didn't touch the photo. He only slid the wallet nearer the table's edge so it wouldn't fall. The water in the kettle had gone cold. He didn't reboil it. He stood and switched off the kitchen light, letting the porch's yellow thread into the room just enough. The object's edges rounded and softened, as if someone had passed by and stroked them lightly. He laid his hand on the kitchen doorknob. The hinge made no sound. That silence in the right place made his mouth quiet in the right place too. There was no need for a sentence to end the day. He went back to the table, lifted the dried cup, and set it once more onto the faint circle, like pressing a soft full stop. Then he stood straight, his back not sagging. At the far end of the house, the clock struck one more beat, the sound passing through the doorway as flat as the porch light. A day had been put into line by papers. His part was only to wash a cup and sit with his back straight. That alone was enough for night to come into the house on footsteps that woke no one. 7. Morning poured into the town in a light that was cold and orderly. The road along the river was speckled with leftover salt. The wind skimmed the water's surface and slipped under the hem of his coat. He slung the library tote over his shoulder, his other hand holding a thin, already sealed envelope. The clean smell of paper, mixed with the scent of soap, still on his hands from last night's dishes. Behind him, the porch light held steady and yellow, not blinking a quiet period at the end of the night just past. The library opened at 9. The small bell on the wooden frame rang just enough. Warm air wrapped around him, the radiator under the window breathing evenly. In the children's corner to the right stood a white-painted pine donation box, its lid cut with a narrow slot, a handwritten sign taped on top, "Books for the weekend." The brightly colored picture books lined the low shelves, some with frayed edges from many small hands turning pages. On the round rug, two children sat cross-legged. One held a book with a bear wearing a knitted hat on the cover. He walked straight to the box. The envelope fit the slot exactly. When he let it go, it tapped the wooden side with a soft sound, then fell to rest somewhere inside, out of sight. The sound did not call for witnesses. It only confirmed a clearer direction for the warmth that remained. He kept his hand over the slot for a second, the smoothness of the paint under his fingertip recalling the night he wiped the kitchen table dry. May was at the main desk, clipping a pin to the pocket of her cardigan. She looked up as he turned back. No questions, no stock phrases. She only nodded a small, sufficient nod the way one acknowledges that mail has arrived, books have been returned, or the season has changed. Her eyes paused for a beat on the library tote where the edge of the manila binder showed. He nodded back as well, the kind of nod that doesn't urge the conversation to stretch another line. On the notice board by the door, the new month's activity calendar was pinned by one corner with a red tack. Beneath it, the printed appointment slip for the key handover he had brought from home. A copy for the property manager already bore a thin, black received stamp. The dry ink sharpened the feel of the date's firmness. There were no morning apology texts, no explanations by phone. There was only the key handover set clearly in the reminders, and the places of collision in the house were quieter, hinges oiled, porch lights steady, the way people moved down the hall, no longer dragging chairs to squeal. He sat on the long wooden bench in the nonfiction aisle, where someone's hands had polished a faint shine over the years. From there, he could see straight into the children's corner, the round rug, the cup of crayons, the paper oak tree taped to the wall. A small child reached out to touch a book cover, ran a hand down the spine, then put the book back exactly where it belonged. A simple act of order that eased him, like seeing a chair pushed back up to the table after someone stands. Paper rustled against fabric in his breast pocket. He took out a sheet folded in half, the crease straight, the blue ink dry since last night. His handwriting was small, slightly slanted, even as a row of shelved books. From now on, let the evidence speak, the rest time. He touched his index finger to the line, not to correct it, but to confirm its depth once more. Then he folded it back and slipped it into the same old pocket. The paper lay there like a pocket map, not to show off, but to remember the way home. He stood and passed the desk to return May's look. She nudged toward him a packet of clear plastic sleeves left over from yesterday, said nothing, set it lightly on the counter's edge so it wouldn't slide. He took it and tucked it into the tote, the plastic brushing the manila with a sound like wind nudging through the row of leafless trees by the river. Things passed from hand to hand without big sounds. Objects understood their work. People kept back their words for when they were needed. As he pushed the door open to leave, the river wind skimmed a thin layer across his collar again, not as biting as 2 days ago. Late sun struck the remnant ice along the curb, breaking into dry white streaks. He crossed the street, walking slowly so the tote thumped his hip in a steady rhythm. The red circles on the refrigerator at home rose in his mind like buoys set along the bank. The key handover, the ledger reconciliation, the call the handyman to check the back door handle. No need for hashtags or underlining, only the right day, the right hour. Back at the house, the kitchen kept an even warmth. He opened the drawer and slid the new receipt into the tracking envelope, added a fine pencil line to the table of contents. On the table, the empty coffee cup turned its handle inward like a quiet invitation to anyone who needed to sit and let the paper speak in their stead. He washed his hands, dried them, set both palms on the tabletop so the feel of the wood under his skin could confirm that lunch would go on as usual, maybe a slice of bread and a small pan, no more, no less, for a small storm had passed. Outside on the porch, the sound of cars leaving the street did not make the light tremble. Inside, The footsteps seemed to avoid each other better. When one person stepped into the living room, the other waited in the kitchen, and they didn't bump. Tomorrow, there might still be things not worth saying, administrative texts arriving like a supermarket schedule, but the routes through the house had fewer sharp corners. The space between objects felt wider by half a centimeter. Enough for an exhale that didn't brush against anyone. Before he sat down, he took the paper from his pocket once more and looked at his line under the porch's yellow pooling on the kitchen floor. From now on, let the evidence speak, the rest time. He folded it, slipped it back, his back straighter than his old habit. The wall clock ticked into a new minute, the sound no longer like a dunning reminder, but like a small hammer tapping a beam to check its soundness. He drew his chair to the table, set the cup on the faint ring, and sat. He did not wait for anyone to knock, nor did he shut the door tight. He left an opening just wide enough for whoever needed to hand over a key for some hello to pass through without bumping the table's edge. In the end, there was no verdict read aloud. There was only the steady yellow light on the porch, the cup set snug into the old ring on the tabletop, and the binder's spine thickened by one more notch for one more receipt. The tracking envelope grew thinner, his back a little straighter. Revenge, if it must be named, turned out to be the way a grown man chooses to put everything back where it belongs, money to where money goes, boundaries to where boundaries go, silence to the place that belongs to silence. The rest he left to time. There was no apology and no explanation, only the key handover tucked neatly into the reminders, the hinges gone quiet, and the paths through the house colliding less. Justice here did not dawdle and preen. It moved by black ink, steel clips, and small tasks completed before words. From now on, when needed, the papers would speak, and the heart, having reset itself, could claim the right to rest. If you have ever chosen a gentle kind of payback like this, clearing a small corner, changing a light bulb, writing a line to yourself, leave a short sentence below. What have you once put back in its proper place to protect yourself? One small detail is enough for those who come after to know they are not alone.